And looking back, SoundGecko, people love the brand, they love the app. All we had to do was slowly add the Omny radio features to SoundGecko, and we could have got there over time versus trying to do this big vision at once. And I think with the Omny radio product, what we found is people loved it, but to make it work really well, you needed a lot of content, you needed it in the right small formats, you needed to get to know a user. There were so many things we had to get right for someone to have an awesome experience. And so we either ended up with these power users that loved us, or people that would use it occasionally, but wasn't that much better than them listening to their Spotify or their podcast app.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Rohit Bhargava, and you are listening to episode 175 of the Startup Playbook podcast, a weekly series where I sit down with successful tech founders, investors, and operators to unpack their journey, lessons, and insights to help current and future entrepreneurs. The voice that you heard a little bit earlier was that of Ed Hooper, the co-founder and CEO of GXE, and our guest for this episode. Ed was previously the co-founder and CEO of Omny Studio, an audio management platform that helped media companies and podcasters grow their audience, reduce their production costs, and monetize their platform. Omny Studio was later acquired by Triton Digital. He is now the co-founder and CEO of GXE, an all-in-one platform for investment funds, family offices, and syndicates. It's the platform that we use to manage the back-end infrastructure of Playbook Ventures. As you can tell, Ed has deep experience on both sides of the table. And in this episode, he opens up on the lessons from his journey as both a founder-investor, including his process of validating startup ideas and for solving big problems, how to get and effectively leverage strategic investors, lessons and mistakes from his journey, including shutting down a really popular feature at Omny Studio, the risks that come from utilizing safe notes when fundraising, and much more. But before we get into this interview, 3 very quick notes from me. So firstly, I have an exciting announcement to make that I'll share more details of at the end of this interview, so make sure you stick around till the end. Secondly, Ed and I discuss some investment strategies in this interview. It goes without saying, but nothing on this podcast is intended as investment advice, and as always, you should do your own due diligence. And finally, a big thank you to our partners for this episode. For those of you that have listened to the podcast for a while would know that many years ago, I was involved with bringing a B2B SaaS accelerator program to Australia from the US. A big problem back then for companies that we were investing in, as well as companies that I'm investing in now through Playbook Ventures, especially for those selling to large enterprise customers, was getting ISO 27001 and SOC 2 compliance. These certifications are so important for building credibility and trust with large enterprise customers and getting them across the line, but can be such a big distraction and operational drain for startups. Thankfully, there's a tool to help with this. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work required for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. There are over 6,000 fast-growing companies that use Vanta to manage their risk and prove their security in real time. To watch Vanta's 3-minute demo video or to speak to a local team member, head over to vanta.com/playbook. And finally, Sender is the OG startup accounting firm in Australia catering for all stages of your business life. If you're busy running your business, you don't have time to balance your books or forecast, and instead you can fully outsource your finance function so that you have the time and resources you need to focus on what you do best, which is growing your business. They have a dedicated focus on founders, funders, and startups, and have an experienced team that can help you with everything from balancing your books to managing your tax to even helping with your exit strategy. I trust and use them for all of my businesses and can't speak about them highly enough. To speak to Gareth or the team, head over to sender.com. With that out of the way, and without further ado, here is my interview with Ed Hooper. Hi, Ed. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast. This has been a long time coming, so great to finally have you on the show.
Thanks for having me as a long-time listener, especially when I lived in the US. It's good to be here. Big fan.
Yeah, we were just kind of talking you were OG listening back to this back when you were in the US. So yeah, appreciate that. So Ed, obviously we've known each other for a very long time, but for those people that maybe aren't as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. So right now I'm currently the co-founder and CEO of a startup called GXE. We do the back end of investment firms like funds, syndicates. We also help family offices. Before that, I was the co-founder of a business called Omny Studio. It's like a SaaS audio management platform. So in Australia, we have clients like Hamish and Andy, the AFL, Mamma Mia. It's used all over the world. It was quite the journey, how it ended up like it did, which we'll be able to talk about in this podcast, which I'm pretty excited about. And then on the side, I've done a bit of angel investing. And then I also have a fund called Cardinia Ventures. It's now fully deployed, but that's backed about probably 45 founders over the past 8 years.
That's a fair bit. It's a decent portfolio. I guess especially knowing you like I do, and I think for most people that have been in the space for a while, there's a lot of parts of their journey that they often skip over when they're giving you a brief summary. But I think your first startup was called Soak, which went through was it like a Microsoft competition or something like that? Do you want to share a little bit about what that was and the story behind that?
Yeah, so flashback to 2008. I was a uni student. I was in my final year of university. I was living in Melbourne. And I'd noticed that my course I was doing didn't have any practical subjects. Whereas some of my friends are doing software engineering, they had this like industrial project where they got to build something. And so I was like, okay, if I was going to hire someone, surely the people that have worked on some cool project and it's real and they can talk about it, that's who I'd hire. So I need to do my own project to get some experience. So I teamed up with 3 buddies, one of which was a co-founder of Omny Studio later on. And we made this farm management system called Soak. And so the original idea was you've got your farm and you can see it on Google Maps. We're going to put sensors all over the farm and we'll be able to work out, do you need to water, yes or no? And then from there, if you do need to water, do we wait for it to rain or do we need to use the water you've got? And if we do that, are we going to run out of water? So all these kind of smart decisions around how to manage like water on a farm. And we had sensors and we had data feeds and it was pretty cool. So anyway, when we started that, we didn't know what a startup was. It was just a university project. We wanted some experience. So we didn't incorporate, we didn't sign any details of IP and we set off on this journey. And then, I'd been following Microsoft pretty closely. I'd interned there and they had this competition called the Imagine Cup and it was started by Bill Gates and it was like the Olympics for high school and college kids. And so we went in it, we won the Australian final. And then in July of 2008, we won the world final. And then suddenly, so one of our judges was a guy named Daniel Lewin. He was super helpful to us after we won. He worked for Steve Jobs at Apple and Next. And there's a great chapter in the Jobs Walter Isaacson book around whether he steals Daniel Lewin or not and how it was like a big deal. So anyway, suddenly these like awesome people were looking at our work and saying, hey, you need to turn this into a company. You need to come to Silicon Valley. And so Microsoft sent us to Silicon Valley. We got to meet tech companies. We met accountants, lawyers, like VCs. We got this crash course and we walked away going, wow, we need to do all this stuff and we are not ready. And by this time, the trip got delayed because of the financial crisis. So like Lehman Brothers collapsed. And so by the time they actually sent us, it wasn't until mid 2009. And by then the startup had lost a lot of momentum. A lot of us, including myself, had started working grad jobs. And so Soak was this like opportunity that should have been an awesome startup, but we just couldn't get there, but definitely learnt a lot along the journey and I'm still friends with all the original founders to this day.
Yeah, and I think I had a very similar kind of introduction to the startup space. I think when we might have first met was when I used to come to Melbourne. I was living in Sydney at the time to do startup weekend competitions and stuff like that because you were working out of YBF at that time with Omny. And I think, like you said, it's almost, I was fortunate enough the first one that I was a part of, like we won. The second one, I think I came second. And the third one, we were offered investment before the judges' scores came out. And I'm like, it's it's one of those things where you are exposed to a lot of really cool and interesting people, but you also get this confidence, especially if you can build something or meet really interesting people there. And for me anyways, it was such a big exposure piece on just understanding the space because like you, I was like, I love this idea and this concept, but I know nothing at all about building companies and those sorts of things. But yeah, what was from that kind of experience with Soak, were there particular things that you were exposed to or learnt, particularly through your time in Silicon Valley, that shaped how you thought about building what was next, which is Omny?
Yeah, I think one of the things we noticed was over there at that time in early 2009, they had a real set formula of you start the company, you raise this much money, you do your legals this way, you just naturally move here. And it was this kind of well-oiled machine, at least from the people that we met. We, on the other hand, because we'd started off as like this project, who owns it? How do we sign the IP over? How do we make a company? What if some people are going to do it full time? What if some people aren't? And I think there's a lot of things that in my later companies we set up early from the start that we had to pick up later on with this other one that became really troublesome. And so I think working out at the start, who owns what, making sure the company owns the IP. If there's a really tough decision, who gets to make the call? Because we had 4 of us and we had situations where 2 people wanted one direction, 2 people wanted the other, and it froze us. And then the feedback I got from one of the VCs was like, hey, the stuff you're getting really back and forth about between your team is really light stuff. When you have actual hard decisions to make, you're really going to struggle. And so you need to have a clear structure for making decisions and follow it. And I'll never forget that exposure.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because that was one of my big experiences. So Stage Label, which was my first startup, came off the back of Startup Weekend, and we left the weekend with 7 people in total. And we had 2 other people in Sydney. So there was like 9 co-founders in the business, which, because of the sheer size of that, we had to work things out. And then similarly, I was like, how do you work out equity and decision-making and all of those sort of things? And thankfully got some really good advice from a guy named Phil Boswell, who was working at LifeX at the time. Any advice for founders who are maybe at a similar point of being very early in their decision, but they've got 1 or 2 co-founders and they're navigating some of this sort of stuff? It can be hard, especially if you're going through it for the first time. Do you have any advice on, or perspectives on, things like equity splits and how to go about doing that in a fair and effective way?
Yeah, so I try and break it into what are the roles the company needs to do the initial kind of like MVP or to test some of it out. Out of the team you've got right now, who can fill those roles? And of that team, do they want to do part-time or after hours or full-time? And then the equity should be based on when you join the company, if you're there right at the start, what you're going to bring to the table and how much you're going to put in. So back to that example you had with all these different co-founders. If some came in on the side and they got, say, less equity than the people that wanted to do it full-time, that makes total sense. I think there's no real right way to do it, but I've definitely seen some interesting structures, and I think vesting and some of these other avenues a lot of folks do fix some of those problems, where if people leave but they got their equity for the time they were there, I think that does solve a lot of challenges. And one of the things I found tough with Soak was finding lawyers and people who got it, whereas like now there's all these law firms that are startup friendly. They've all got pretty standard docs and they've worked with a lot of the funds and they can tell you if what you're doing is going to really set things off. It's really changed a lot since then.
Yeah. And so maybe fast forwarding from your experience with Soak, where, as you said, just given kind of the timeframes, the momentum wasn't quite there and you'd all moved on. I think you went to ANZ and then Rome to Rio and then Groupon. Yeah,
I was trying a lot of different stuff. So I joined ANZ Bank and did their grad program. And then at night time, I worked on the Soak startup. Then as part of ANZ, I was fortunate enough to get to work on the ANZ iPhone app, which is called Go Money. And we launched it and it was really successful. And I learned a lot working on the kind of product management side. Anyway, while I was still at ANZ, I met these 2 founders, Bernie and Michael. And they'd worked at Microsoft where I'd worked, and they just moved back to Melbourne from being in Seattle, and they'd started this startup, Rome to Rio. They'd only been doing it for a few months, and I was just like, guys, this is great. I would use this product. Here are my learnings from the last startup, and we just kept catching up. And then they were really nice guys. The tech they were building was just phenomenal, and so they said, hey, well, we like working with you and you like working with us. And so I said, hey, yeah, I'd love to work with you. And so I started doing a day a week for them after hours. And yeah, the product got launched. They did a funding round. They really started to take off. And they were working out of Inspire 9 when it was really small. They were speaking a lot of stuff. They were really doing their part to help build the Melbourne startup ecosystem. And then into that tenure, as much as I was loving Rome to Rio, I just wasn't enjoying my day job. And so I was looking at moving to the US, and a buddy of mine called me and he said, hey, there's this company, they called Groupon. It's massive in the US. It's setting up in some of these other countries. They bought my startup and I'm now in the Australian team. Why would you go to uni to get a job like this or do this when you can come here and you can get a really good job now? Let me put you in touch with a recruiter. And so I had a few chats with the people at Groupon. It was pre-IPO. I think it was like 30 people in Australia and New Zealand at the time. And so the Australian New Zealand CEO was great. And I thought, okay, I could learn a lot from this guy. And so, yeah, joined them and moved to Sydney. I think this is before remote, so it made it really hard to do the Rome to Rio stuff because so much of it I got from spending FaceTime with the guys. And so we decided, hey, I'll pause there and I'll give Groupon a really red hot go, and I'll still be a friend to the company. And so Rome to Rio just continued to do well, and it was sold in 2019. They did a couple of funding rounds. They've delighted users all over the world with multimodal travel, which is so cool. And so anyway, I did this Groupon job, and Groupon, we grew. We're at a few hundred people within 6 months. We had all this money. We were trying to hit the numbers before the IPO. Group buying was still hot and hadn't got saturated. But I started to get itchy feet again, and I realized I really just wanted to do a startup. And so I think it was late Jan of 2012, I got a call from my good friend Long. He was one of the guys I'd done the soap startup with. He was like a blogger, and he'd built some really cool apps, and he was just incredible designer, developer. He called me, he's like, hey, I've got this idea for a startup. I'd love to run it by you. And it was really similar to what I'd been thinking about. And so we ended up brainstorming on this kind of idea. And so fortunately, Australia Day was the next day. And so instead of the plans I had, I locked myself in a room and wrote a business plan for what this kind of Omny radio business could be. And I called Long back the day after and was like, hey, here's what I've got. What do you think? And he's like, whoa, I wasn't expecting this. This looks really good. And so we went through it. We realized we needed another developer to really help us. So kind of like this mini business plan. Whenever I've got an idea to check it out, I always go, how would you describe it in a sentence? How would you describe it in a couple of paragraphs? What's the market opportunity? Is there anyone else already doing it? What would the pricing be? What are some of the benefits versus what's there? And usually by going through this process, I discover someone that's already done it, or it's too hard to get to the MVP, or it's nice to have. It's not a true painkiller. But with this one, I just couldn't see any issues. So Long and I got pretty excited. And so I called my good friend Andrew Armstrong and said, hey, Long and I want to do this company. We want to quit our jobs. We need a third person to be the CTO. Are you interested? And he was keen. So I flew down to Melbourne. We met up and we started talking about it. And so with this in mind, I'm like, oh, if I'm quitting my job, I'm not going to have any salary. So we all agreed we'd give this thing a go for a year. And if we didn't get some traction or raise some money or bring in some revenue, that we'd switch to part-time and maybe get jobs as well. So we knew we had 1 year to work this thing out. So just to get some feedback, I set up some meetings with some investors. And literally the first meeting I had, at the end of the meeting, the investor said, hey, this is great. Can I write you a check? And at that point, I knew there was something there.
Yeah. The classic thing that everyone tells you doesn't really happen.
Oh, I know. And it was a very small ecosystem back then. So you could fit on one hand the number of investors we actually spoke to.
Yeah. And knowing that that's a very different time and a lot less capital and sources of capital as well over there, what did that initial pitch for Omny look like?
So the original idea for the business was Omny Radio. And so I'd moved to Sydney from Melbourne, and in the morning I used to walk to work and I'd listen to the radio and I'd get news, sport updates, music, and I'd grown up with the Melbourne radio stations, so I knew them. I moved to Sydney. Suddenly there's all these other radio stations. I don't know what they are. Everyone's talking about rugby instead of AFL. Some stations had great commentators, but I wanted different music. And so my idea was, how do you get this radio feed that everyone in the whole country or one city listens to? And how do you break it up into little pieces so it can be personalized? So things like only give me the traffic if I'm in the car. If I pause and then I resume on my iPad or in the car, pick up where I left off. If I don't like something, let me skip. What a lot of people do now with podcasting and with music. And so we're trying to build this super app that was like Spotify plus podcasting plus text-to-speech updates. And so Long's idea was he was driving to work and he just wanted this feed that was going to tell him, hey, and this is when Facebook was a lot bigger than it is now from a usage perspective. Hey, it's these friends' birthdays. Hey, you've got 28 emails in your work inbox, which is higher than normal. Hey, it's going to take you this long to get to work because there's traffic. And then then we merged our ideas and said, hey, we should just have this personal audio feed. And then we looked at it and we said, wow, if we know all this info about the users, you could do targeted ads, which are going to be better than the blanket ones. And so therefore we should be able to charge more for these targeted ads. And so, yeah, that was it. And we just set out and started building it and started talking to people and got really excited.
Yeah. And there's also a big vision of this, but I understand the first thing that you released under that company was a product called SoundGecko, which took off really well. Again, do you want to share a little bit about what that process was and what happened with that?
Yeah, sure. So it's 2012. We've raised a really small amount of money where we're living pretty nimble, working out of York Butter Factory, one of the big co-working spaces in Melbourne at the time. And we're working on this personalized radio app. Originally it was called One-to-One Cast, which was a terrible name. Why we changed it later. And so I was convinced that people would like music and people would like short audio professional content. But one of the things we were trying to really work out is, would people like the text to speech? Would the quality be good enough? Were the updates useful enough? And so we said, all right, well, it's going to be ages before this audio app's ready because there's a lot of tech we need to build. Why don't we release just part of the text to speech bit just to test it and see if users actually like it? And then we can do the app without it. And so Long came up with this great idea for an app called SoundGecko, where you'd go to soundgecko.com, you'd put in the URL to a web article, and you put in your email, and you press send, and then it would send you back an MP3 of the text-to-speech of that article. And the idea was Long had all these TechCrunch articles he wanted to read, but he was too tired after working on our startup all day, so he just wanted to listen to them as he commuted home. And so we put that up in, I think, early July of 2012. Then suddenly it was on the verge. And then suddenly all these people from all over the world were using it and it crashed. And so we had to scale it up and put up more servers and fix that. Then more people listed it on other places. And so we'd go into this cycle where we'd get some press, we'd get all this usage, and then it would tail off, but then some of the users would stick around. And so for the back half of 2012, we added an iOS app, we added an Android app, we had it running in Ford cars using their sync system that they used to have. And we got really conflicted because we had this SoundGecko app that had hundreds of thousands of active users, and we even launched like a pro plan where people were paying money. And then on the flip side, though, we told all these investors, hey, we're doing this radio app and text-to-speech is only a little bit of it, and it's going to be this master audio feed. We need to build that as well. And so we were, for a pretty small team, we were really resource constrained, and we were trying to focus on two different products, and it definitely made things interesting.
Yeah, when you're in the thick of it, it's so hard to make those trade-offs on things as well. You hear people kind of sunsetting popular products and it being the right thing because you're going after this much bigger opportunity. But I know that we've had conversations around this, around maybe just learnings through that experience, because you ended up shutting SoundGecko off to focus on the bigger opportunity. And in hindsight, maybe it was a better pathway to going down, adding features onto SoundGecko instead. I guess having gone through that process and those learnings, and for founders that are maybe potentially in a similar situation where they've launched a feature and seeing some nuggets of traction and things taking off, how would you suggest that they think about those trade-offs and those important decisions?
Yeah, I think what we found really tough is we got a lot of advice across our journey where there are examples of, it's the main thing's not working, you should pivot, and then the pivot works and you get this amazing company, and people would talk about Slack coming out of a video game and Flickr coming out of something else, and quite a few examples. But then you hear these other examples where they just kept at it, and then eventually they found what had product market fit and it really took off. And it's, well, both can be right. What do we do? And so we'd always try and talk to a few different people. And then as the founding team, we'd own the decision and make the call ourselves. And I think in hindsight, things are a lot easier. So looking back, because we just put SoundGecko out there and it got all this attention and got this user base, we assumed we'd be able to do that again. And so we stopped working on SoundGecko. We eventually shut it down, and we worked on our main app, Omny Radio. And what we found was building the Omny Radio base to be as big as what SoundGecko was a lot harder. And we put everything into it and it grew slower. And looking back, SoundGecko, people love the brand, they love the app. All we had to do was slowly add the Omny Radio features to SoundGecko, and we could have got there over time versus trying to do this big vision at once. And I think with the Omny Radio product, what we found is people loved it, but to make it work really well, you needed a lot of content, you needed it in the right small formats, you needed to get to know a user. And so we had like a content recommendation engine. We call it Smart Mix. It's like Facebook newsfeed, but for audio. There were so many things we had to get right for someone to have an awesome experience. And so we either ended up with these power users that loved us, or people that would use it occasionally, but was it that much better than them listening to their Spotify or their podcast app?
Yeah. Like you said, there's no one formula for any of these sort of decisions, but you have to decide one way or another.
Tough.
It is super tough. I guess maybe even just looking at your experience with that, how did you absorb the information that you were getting from all these advisors? And in my experience, whenever you've got people, everyone's got an opinion, everything's traditionally always conflicting. What were the things that you used to decide what what was the thing that you wanted to double down on from a business perspective?
Yeah, I think we looked at a ton of variables, and we did take a while to make the call. I think we're more excited about the Omny Radio opportunity. I don't think we fleshed out well enough the path of building it in SoundGecko, and didn't really fully realize how good that could have been until later. We'd taken a lot of money from investors who we'd set out to do that original kind of Omny Radio piece, and so that played a factor as well. And yeah, it was over 10 years ago now. There was just a lot going on. And yeah, we really believe that if we got the radio product right and got it out there, it would just thrive.
Yeah. I think anyone that's done a startup before, there are just so many lessons and experiences and stories. And I think one of the things that I've always really appreciated in our personal conversations is just how open and willing you've been to share some of the war stories around these sort of things. Every experience is different, but at least if you hear from someone that's gone through it before and understood their process around it, that's super helpful, or at least helps you see through corners. I know one of the other things that we've spoken about is safe notes as well. And they're the easiest thing to get up and going once you're raising your funding round, but there are complications that come the longer that you keep that process going. And so again, do you mind sharing I know you've got an interesting experience with that with Omny, but do you want to share a little bit about what that process was like inside?
Yeah, sure. And so for those listening that haven't used a convertible note or a safe note, essentially the predicament we're in is, so we're doing Omny, we'd raised a little bit of money. The original 2 rounds we did were equity, where we priced it. But then we had this SoundGecko app, it was taking off. We were really excited about the Omny radio app. Our team, very technical, strong team. And so we'd meet these investors and they'd say, hey, we think our business is worth this. And they'd go, well, we think your business is worth this down here. And there was this delta in the middle. And so the great thing about a safe note or a convertible note is you can say, look, we can't agree. Let's do this note and it'll get priced later when you do the next round. Safe notes hadn't become a thing yet. So in 2012 and 13, we did a couple of convertible notes. And so they had the cap. If we raised at a certain amount, we'd hit that cap, or they had a 20% discount. Now, the clause that we, looking back, should have handled better is, and the investors did tell us this was our fault that we agreed to this. We had a maturity clause in there. And so if we didn't raise money by a certain amount of time, the notes converted at a pretty low valuation to equity. And so when it was just 1 or 2 notes, it was fine. Because we'd stacked 3 of them over 2 years, it ended up being quite a big dilution hit. And we spoke to the note holders. Some of them were like, hey, we'll give you an extension. But there were some that were like, well, hang on, we agreed to this and this is what should happen. And I think they just wanted us to do a bigger round and trigger the notes and really have the company live up to its potential. And so back then, the funding ecosystem was a lot smaller. We had some Australian investors that were helping us. We brought on a strategic. We had Southern Cross Stereo, the big radio giant in Australia, and they were fantastic. And so I'd been in the US and I'd gotten some really good feedback on what we needed to do to be like match fit to get a raise done. And so anyway, the feedback was, hey, you need to launch this Omny radio app. You need to get some users and you need to come back to us when you've got some traction. You've got a bit of a plan for what coming to the US looks like. And a lot of people seem to understand it in the US because there'd been Pandora there. So it was like, hey, Pandora, but all the bits of content that you'd get in radio. And people were like, oh, okay. So I flew over in November. We'd launched the app in October. I had a month of data and the data was pretty good for month 1. And I had a couple of meetings and I remember I was in this co-working space where my friend was letting me hot desk there and his startup worked there. And one of his investors was there. And so this VC said, hey, I'll give you some feedback. Sure, let's like sit down. And so the VC was like, okay, it's about to be Thanksgiving week. All the VCs are checked out. You're literally here at a terrible time. Your company's based in Australia. Yeah, we've heard of Atlassian and some of these others, but can it be an American company? That's going to scare a lot of people off. And yeah, you're doing radio. Radio's dead, and podcasting, that was meant to work. But look at Twitter. There was a pivot away from a podcasting company. And even Apple haven't made podcasting big. This is before Serial had come out and some of these other breakout hits in the podcasting world. And so I remember just walking away from that meeting going, wow, okay, this is going to be really tough. And so I spent the whole of Thanksgiving week basically in this co-working space. I set up camp in this big boardroom because no one else was in the co-working space. Everyone was like off. And I basically worked out, okay, we've literally got to raise a round in the US, needs to be at least $1 million, and we need to convert these notes, and we're going to get some traction, and it's going to be great, and we're going to find a way to do it. And so I put this plan together. I called the team. We went through it all. And we ended up getting it done. And we found a family out of North Carolina that invested, that triggered all the notes. And yeah, we had this vision of bringing the app to the US and doing some cool stuff. And yeah, everyone I spoke to said, you're dreaming, it's not going to happen. And they had all these reasons why, but we made it work.
That's awesome. And I think such a story that a lot of founders can probably relate to around those sort of things as well. You touched on this a couple of times. One was when I wrote a business plan for Omny, and then it sounds like whenever you've kind of got these critical moments in the business, you lock yourself away and really give yourself time to think. Just curious, if you're able to share, what was the plan to do that? And then secondly, is there a framework or a process that you go through when you're going into deep problem solving mode with those sort of things that helps you unearth what a potential plan or a solution might look like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really helpful is along the journey, a different friend who's been a very successful founder and has done a lot of angel investments and raised a lot of money from VCs, agreed to shadow me in a couple of my US investor meetings and gave me some really good feedback. And it was really direct and it was super helpful. And so one of the bits of feedback was know your numbers and be really well thought out in how you answered the question. Because what would happen is I'd have this VC meeting and they'd be like, what is X? And I'd go, oh, well, to get X, you need to understand Y, and then it might get bigger if there's Z. And he's like, no, you need to just say X is this. And then they'll go, what's Y? Y is this. And then they already know the market or they know bits of it. And if they get enough info, then they're going to really flesh out some of these other pieces. And then I had another friend who did the same thing and she gave me really similar feedback. And so as soon as I started answering their questions well, in the meetings I had, I'd get through more of the meeting and they could understand the business better and I got a lot more out of it. They got a lot more out of it. So that was one piece of it. Then the other piece they told me was when they say, hey, radio is a bad industry or this is this, they're looking for you to jump in and say, well, I disagree and here's why we're excited and share what that is. And so when I locked myself away, I think a lot of that was not much was going to happen in the US because it was Thanksgiving. My co-founders and other team members who are all great, we were able to get on the phone and work through it together. And a lot of it was working out, okay, we've got all this great feedback. How do we apply that to our situation? And do we want to raise in Australia or do we want to raise here? And what does it look like? And we ended up flipping up to become a US company. That solved the US part. The investor we got believed that this radio 2.0 could be really awesome and actually owned a lot of radio assets that they were excited to bring to the table. And so I think it's just getting data, getting advice, and then just thinking it through and having a chat as co-founders and then working out what our plan is. And we didn't always agree on the plan we adopted. And that comes back to that earlier point around the decision making. Yeah.
It sounds like you were very strategic with the capital that you took on board as well and the value that those investors could provide. I know that corporate venture capital gets a pretty bad rap for the most part for various reasons, but I know from previous conversations you've mentioned that you had Southern Cross Austereo as, what were they, an investor?
Yeah, so when SoundGecko came out, we got this guy in the UK named Clive Dickens reached out to us, and he was working at a big media company there, and he'd put some money into Shazam when it was like 4 friends around a kitchen table, and he emailed us, he said, "There's something here with SoundGecko. I want to have a call with you. I help Shazam. I get this. Let's have a chat." And we're like, okay, great. And so without us bringing him on as an advisor or anything, we're in Silicon Valley at the time. He was like, oh, meet some of these people. And he introduced us to all these amazing people. Anyway, he ended up becoming a company advisor. He put us in touch with SCA and he actually moved to Australia in the end and ended up working for them. And so we met SCA and we just said, here's this vision we have and here's how it's good for you guys. And they were really excited. So they invested in us, but the money was only a small part. What was super valuable was being able to come in and they let us talk to people all across their organization. How do you archive all their content? Where does your revenue come from? What does it look like for the really big shows like a Hamish and Andy versus one of the really small rural shows in Ballarat for doing everything? And so we worked really hard with them on what would this dream solution look like that would help you manage your organization. And we spoke to people in finance, people in content, people in operations, and aside helping us with the requirements, they became like one of our first customers. After a while, we decided, okay, we've got this consumer radio app, Southern Cross Austereo really like it. How do we get the content from their big Triple M or hit or whatever their radio program was? It'd be like 1 to 3 hours. How do we turn that into a ton of 1 minute to 4 minute clips that we can arrange in radio that they can also put on social media and on YouTube and on all these places? And so off working with them, we discovered that we needed a whole separate tool called Omny Studio, which would solve all of their problems, but then it would also, as a byproduct, give us all the content we need and give it to us in real time. So we ended up building this whole B2B product to help them and a few other early adopters. And as a side benefit, we got all this content we needed, which is really cool. And we would have never discovered that if we hadn't have worked with them. And they gave us credibility. They gave us introductions. They put so much people hours into supporting us. They gave us introductions. And yeah, it was definitely a game changer for that business. And the investor we got in the US did the same thing from the US perspective. And yeah, it was super helpful.
So Ed, I know that Omny sold in 2019 or got acquired in 2019. What was that process like for you guys? Obviously, it was a long journey from, sounds like early 2012 when you first launched SoundGecko and putting all these things together. Is it a difficult process to get to a point to finally step away or put the company in someone else's hands, or were you all ready to move on at that point?
Yeah, so we'd started up the business, we'd done SoundGecko, we got Omny Radio out, we worked out we needed to build this tool, Omny Studio, that really set up Omny Radio by doing the back end of all the media companies. Over time, we realized that a lot of the media companies weren't that interested in Omny Radio, they just wanted Omny Studio. And so with that in mind, we made the really tough call to just focus on that as the business. And then so we grew it all over the world. And as part of that, we appointed a channel partner in the US, which is a company called Triton. And so what was really great about them becoming on as a channel partner is they're already an approved supplier of all these great customers in Europe and across the US and Canada. And they had quite a lot of team members and their own great products. And we worked out that our system perfectly plugged into what they were doing. So if a company was using Omny Studio, they'd get all these clips, they'd get all this data, they could then push it out on all these different channels. So Hamish and Andy would have Miley Cyrus on, she'd give some great interview, and they'd be able to press a button and it would be a video on YouTube and it would be on Google Podcasts. And if there was ads, we'd put in the ad markers where the platform could bring them. And if there wasn't, we could generate the ads, and the ads were coming from Triton. And so we had this great partnership with them. And so they worked out that anyone who used our platform became a much better customer for them. And so they became a reseller. And so they started reselling our product to all these customers, and it gave us a ton of traction. We got to know each other. And then after a while, they were like, hey, our products really work well together. We've got a whole suite of products. This would be a really good tool to have as part of the tool suite. And I think by the time that happened, we really liked working with them. We'd gotten to know with them. The products had become so tightly linked. Their team was acting as like a sales force. And I think by this stage, we'd been at the business for 7 years. We'd had multiple pivots. We'd almost run out of money. We really needed to either raise some more capital and really swing for the fences, or take this kind of opportunity. And across the kind of shareholder base, I think there were people were more excited about this Triton opportunity. And so that's the path we went down. And yeah, I tell people when I talk about the Omny journey, it took a whole village. We had advisors, we had lawyers, we had accountants, we had great team members, we had investors, strategic investors, and it just took so many people, to even founders or professionals that had coffees with us and gave us advice. It took a whole journey to make that one work. And it was really great having that exit where the brand was going to be kept. It continues to get used. I'll see these little Omny web players on web pages all over the world, and it's doing hundreds of millions of audio impressions every month. And it was a really good place for it to end up, because they were going to invest in it. They were going to roll it out to more people. All the people who'd been part of the journey got a win. Yeah, it was a pretty crazy journey.
Yeah, love it. Someone I spoke to as part of the research process for this interview is Andrew, your co-founder. And one of the things that he mentioned, which I can definitely attest to, is like your superpower as a founder is just the relationships that you seem to build with everyone. I think he gave me a story where you, Long, and him used to go out for lunch when you were working out of YBF. And he's like, every time without fail, you guys would bump into someone that you knew and you'd stop and have a chat. And he's like, at a certain point, they're like, we've got this. We'll just continue walking and head back to YBF and let Ed have his chat. I think it is a really important pillar, as you mentioned, about that village that it takes to build a company, and being able to attract talent and partners and all of those sort of things is critically important. I understand some of this stuff is probably inherent in who you are, but do you have any advice in terms of how you think about or approach building a relationship or building networks with people that would be helpful for founders listening to this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So I think some of the things we did well as part of the Omny journey is we mapped out what does radio look like in Australia, right? There are a few big powerhouse media companies. Then there was this Medium group, and then there's all these independent podcasters and community radio stations. we worked out what that looked like, and then we made sure we knew the appropriate people at the ones we wanted to do business with or have a strategic relationship with. We looked at all the places where audio could go and found our way into Ford and some of these other places. One of the ones that I think we did a good job at, which becomes really helpful down the road, is we looked at who are these strategic people like a Twitter or an Apple or iHeartMedia or some of these others that could one day be really big partners or even acquirers of Omny, just so we could have a relationship with them. And so I used to catch up with someone from the Apple M&A team or podcasting team every 6 months. And we'd just have these chats where it could be a quick phone call, could be an in-person, and we wouldn't give away too much, but we'd say things like, they'd be like, oh, do you believe this is an interesting capability? And we'd say, yes, we are. And they'd say, great, so do we. And then we'd be like, we have a solution that works. And we'd be like, cool, we have one as well. And they'd be like, okay. And we'd have these chats where it's just like, what was going on? What are you working on? And we wouldn't say too much, but they're able to watch us grow and learn about us without us giving away everything. And what was really good about having these relationships is if someone like in our case where Triton says, hey, we'd love to buy you. If you've already over the last 1 year, 2 years gotten to know the corp dev team or some better yet than the corp dev team, some product people, in our case, a Spotify, a Twitter, a Pandora, all these places, it's quite easy to pick up the phone and be like, hey, we've been made an offer. We're at Play. Is there a chance you'd want to work with us? And if they've gotten to know you and whatnot, they can, it's a much better chance that they'll be able to put their foot forward in the race. Whereas if you call them and it's like, hey, we need an offer in 2 weeks. You've never met us before and we're trying to find the right person, it becomes quite hard. And that was the feedback I got from some of my friends in Silicon Valley who'd done it before. They were like, you need to work out who are these really important people in your industry and have a relationship with them. And it could be just from we collaborate on industry items, or it could be from we partner together or merge or get bought. And so I think we did a really good job of knowing all those companies, and we still ended up going down that Triton path, but there were definitely quite a few that were interested. On the flip side, though, I will say it's really easy to spend a ton of time on this stuff. And it wasn't like we were out there just spending all this time on relationship. It was just one of the things I did just to make sure we were at Play. And
stuff only becomes helpful if you're building a company that's worth acquiring as well.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's only a small part of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got a couple of follow-up questions on this. One is, at what stage or how early into Omny's journey did you strategically recognize those people and start making that hit list of those sort of things? Second question is, how do you go about reaching them? And the third one, which I think when I talk to founders a lot about, is how do you build relationships with investors and those sort of things? A lot of it is, what can I tell them that keeps them interested and updated to want to have a meeting every 6 months or so? So 3-parter, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it was probably 12 months in, we started really going, hang on, there's value here. We wouldn't force the relationship. We'd always wait because there are only a few big players that made sense to do with. And so we didn't want to just force our way in with a cold email. It was like, oh, they're going to be at this conference. Let's go and talk to them. Or this person's a mutual connection. Let's wait till we've got a really good reason to talk to them. Or, oh, they're having a hack day. Let's go. I think another one we did pretty well is I'd go to these conferences, and I did this in my Microsoft days. I interned in the team where they'd put on all the conferences and help developers use Microsoft products. And so one of the managers at Microsoft was like, here's the deal. You're at this conference. Just go up and talk to people and just say, hey, what brings you to the conference? And they'll tell you. And if you can help them, help them. If you can't, it might be a small chat. But he said, so many opportunities I've had in my life have come from just finding people, talking to them, and seeing if there's a way you can help them. And so I'd go to these events and these conferences and just talk to people, and they'd say, oh, I'm at the conference because I do this. And I'd be like, oh, why do this? Maybe we might be able to help you out with that. Or you should go talk to Shauna over there. She's really good at this. Or James over here. And just got really good at working out how to talk to people and make opportunities work. And you can't connect the dots forward. Some of the seeds we planted came back and really helped us, but most of them didn't. And people used to say to us, oh, you're so lucky you got this thing or this other piece here. And we'd say, hey, we tried 90 things and you're looking at the 7 that worked. And the rest of it was a lot of misses. So that was that piece. On the investor bit, I definitely met some founders sometimes where they're looking for an angel check and they've started their round, they haven't done much prep, and they go and hit up their top 5 choices for funding right away. And I always tell them to try and avoid that. So what we used to do when we were raising is we'd make a list of, here's all the investors we'd like to reach. What's the priority? We'd come up with an FAQ so each founder would sit down and come up with all the questions we think we might get asked. Then we'd meet together and agree on what the questions should be. Then we'd all have a go at answering them. And then we'd come back together and agree on what are the 1 or 2 dot points to answer each question. It was really good because it would force us to come up with, okay, Long's answer for this is really good. Let's go with that one. And so we worked out the best answers to all the questions, but it also got us all on the same page as founders. So if I wasn't able to take a meeting and Long took it, Long had the story the exact same way, and it made sense to all the investors. And so then after we did that, we did a few practices with friendlies. Then we'd go out to the investors and just stagger it and go through those meetings. And at the end of every meeting, we'd always say, hey, is there anyone else you think we should meet? And especially in the US, this would lead to, you should meet these people. You should meet these people. And it triangled out, and we got this big kind of network, which is really cool.
Yeah. And I think the third part of that question was, or the first part was, how early into Omny's journey did you strategically make time for those things?
Probably about 18 months. I think all of 2012 and the first half of 2013 was just like building great products, putting it in people's hand to just test things and trying to get like a really good MVP ready. And then we launched in October of 2013. And then it just turned into, okay, people like this, but we need more content. We need more partners. How do we fix that? And it was like different problems.
Yeah. And speaking of relationships, I know that a lot of founders come to you for advice. I've definitely turned to you for advice on a lot of different things, but that sort of opportunity led to Cardinia Ventures, which is the fund that you raised a bit of money for, and as you mentioned, have 45 portfolio companies in that. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Cardinia Ventures started and the type of investments that you make?
Yeah, sure. So over my journey, a lot of great founders had helped me and helped the startups I was involved in, like Rome to Rio and Soak and Omny Studio. And so over time, just through working out of co-working spaces, going to events, going to startup weekends, I was meeting these other founders and just things we'd already tackled. Hey, how do you do your patent in the US? Or how do you get your first hire in another country? Or we're doing our R&D for the first time. Is it worth it or not? Things where they weren't necessarily that hard. It's just we'd done them before, and finding out from someone else who'd done it was just a big accelerator. And so I started meeting these founders, and then quickly after a while, I realized, wow, some of these businesses are way better than ours. And obviously my number one thing is I want to make our business as amazing as possible. But some of them started doing really well, and they said, hey, you've just been so helpful. Do you want to put some money in when we next raise, or can we give you some advisory stock or whatnot? And I said, hey, I don't want to be an advisor because I'm really committed to this Omny Studio journey, but yeah, definitely would be keen to put some money in. And so I looked at it and was like, okay, if I put just my savings in, because we've been living pretty lean doing Omny Studio, I'll be able to do a couple of companies, but it would be really sad if it was company 9 that was the big one and I'd said no because I'd already used all my shots on goal. And so I ended up going, okay, it's a lot smarter to raise a fund and do it that way. And so I did Cardinia Ventures Fund 1. We had about 30 LPs. We raised money, and then I ran it, and some of the other fund investors became advisors and helped out, and we had an IC and all the other pieces. And essentially with these founders, I'd say, hey, I've only got limited time. So they'd get a lead investor, and then I'd put some money in on the side on behalf of Cardinia. And we got into some really exciting rounds that we had no business getting into, that were oversubscribed. And I said to founders afterwards, why did you let us in? They were just like, oh, it was so helpful talking to you because you've done it before, and it's really helpful to hear, oh, when we're in this situation, we did this, or you could do it this way. And as my portfolio experienced more and more challenges, and I experienced more and more challenges and success as well, I was able to help with more and more things. And yeah, we grew this portfolio. We did a lot of pre-seed and seed and a little bit of Series A, but still pretty small checks. And yeah, some of the companies really took off, and then that led to more people wanting to take our checks. And I think what was great about the Cardinia journey is, yeah, some of these founders, they'd call and they'd be in really tough spots. And I pitched it from the start as, hey, we're not really going to do much follow on. So we're in this journey with you. So if you've got any problems, you just call, and often it'll be like, hey, I want to take this to the board. How would you do it? Or I'm having an issue with my co-founder. Like, what's this? And so I just have these private off the record chats, and I think often they already knew the answer. They just wanted a sounding board to talk it through. And in some of the cases, it wasn't that big a deal, but they were worried that it could be, and they just needed a sounding board.
Mm. And sometimes and we've found that with Playbook Ventures as well. Sometimes it's helpful to have someone who's on your cap table in your corner and is an investor, but is more on I would say we're more on the founder side with a lot of those sort of things. A lot of it is either having their round closed, will help them with introductions or back channel a couple of conversations with things around people that we're speaking to anyways to try and get people across the line. Or as you said, a lot of the times things just come up for founders that are very sensitive and time pressure wise, and you don't necessarily want to open everything up to all of your biggest shareholders, but you need to talk to someone that kind of understands the context of the business, has gone through that process before, and just having someone like that in your corner, for me anyways, has been super helpful, and that's something that we try and do for all of our portfolio companies too.
Yeah, and I always tell founders, like, look, definitely get like a lead, but if you can, put a few smaller firms or angels in there, just so you're getting more than one perspective. Because on the Omny Studio journey, we found it really helpful to have a lot of different perspectives. And I think there are times where the founder does call and I'm like, I'm not the best person to answer this particular question, but try this person who's one of the Cardinia LPs maybe, or perhaps there's another fund that's in there that can really help with that particular piece. But it's a really tough journey being a co-founder of a business. And so you need to have these people you can call. And during Omny, we had some tough times where we had one where we almost ran out of money. We had another one where when Southern Cross were going to invest, we were in the US working on that big family office media company that came in, and we were in North Carolina. There was a snowstorm. There was power had gone out of our hotel. So we went to a Denny's because they had Wi-Fi and cheap food, and they were open all night. And yeah, there was this big blow up that almost cancelled the SCA deal, and we had to call some of those advisors in Australia and get some advice. We remained calm. We worked it through with them. We got there, and it was just, when you're in that situation, just having a fresh person to talk to is like so helpful.
Yeah. And on a personal level as well, I know that everyone's different. Everyone's got a different perspective on this, but I have found that almost getting exposure to other people and other people's problems makes me a better founder. And as a result, the things that I'm learning, I can help our founders more. And like, I feel like that's a bit of a flywheel effect for me personally. I know that it probably doesn't make sense for a lot of people to be able to do both or have a willingness to do both. But personally, I've found that it's been helpful on both sides.
Oh, definitely. I think being a founder has definitely helped me on the investor side. I think I've had different amounts of time though I've put to my investing. When I did it while I was doing Omny Studio, it was a very small amount of time I put in. It was gated. And then once we had the exit and I was in between working out what was next, definitely spent a lot more time on it. There was this time in 2019, 2020, where I was really just helping a lot of founders, became an LP in a couple of funds, was investing for quite a few syndicates, and it was my main thing, and it was great. And now as soon as I got back into founder mode, I definitely pulled it back because we've got this new exciting journey, and that needs to be the priority. But I just think it's about having balance, and Andrew and I are really upfront with our investors and team members on what else we do and where our priorities are. And
yeah, definitely. I think if you're running a company, that has to be priority number one, and you just set up the right systems and processes, and like you said, just be really open with everyone. So like, it's fortunate to have James, who's currently in the room listening to this as well, that James was essentially running Playbook Ventures full time, and so I could come in and add value where I needed to, where it was helpful. But again, it's, as you said, it's just finding that right balance for you, because you do need to prioritize on the right things, and unfortunately there are 24 hours in a day.
Exactly.
Yeah. And speaking of big focuses and big things, obviously you've got GXE at the moment, which, just to be upfront as well, I was lucky enough to invest in at your first round, and super stoked to be supporting you on the journey. And obviously we run Playbook Ventures through our syndicate, through GXE as well, which we've been stoked about. But again, for those people that are listening, do you want to share a little bit about the GXE journey as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'd had this Omny Studio journey as like a founder, and then I'd set up my own fund and done that as Cardinia Ventures, and I'd lived in Silicon Valley for a couple of years and really seen just what a more mature ecosystem looks like. And they definitely had a lot of infrastructure that we didn't have in Australia, but then they also had other areas where Australia is definitely doing better as well. And so I moved back in 2019 to Australia. Then Omny Studio got sold. And so I started really ramping up the Cardinia activity, the angel investing, became an LP in a few funds. And anyway, after a while, I was talking to my accountant, and my accountant's like, Ed, you're doing all these deals. They send the paperwork to your email. Some of them don't send anything. Some of these deals, you've got a few people to invest together, and there's a structure, and you're leading it. So you're the one doing the admin for all the structure. And this admin is just not scalable and it's getting worse and worse, and you've got to work something out here. And so I started looking at it, and a lot of the syndicates I was in were having problems with this, the funds. And so I called up Andrew, my co-founder from the first business, Andrew Armstrong, and I said, hey, I know you're having this problem as well. What if we built some infrastructure to streamline doing the back end of syndicates for venture in Australia and New Zealand? Worst case, you and I would be able to use it to solve all our problems. Best case, some other people want to use it as well, and we think we could really help the ecosystem, and there might be a business here. And Andrew was like, yeah, look, that sounds great. And probably one worth mentioning is, so back in 2017, while I was living in the US, Andrew and I had this idea, and we worked on it with one of our other team members from Omny, Rohit McNeese. And we had this idea of, I'd get asked all the time, hey, I'm moving to Adelaide. Are there any awesome founders there I should meet? Or are there any startups that are hiring? Or I'm in Newcastle. Are there any VCs there? Or I'm doing a fashion tech startup. Are there any other ones? And who have they raised from? And so I used to send people these long emails with lists of people, and I'd write them manually, and it was such a drag on my time. And so after a while I was like, Andrew, let's put up a website, and it can just be a directory of all the investors in Australia and all the startups, and we'll just put it up. It'll get SEO and it'll help people, and then we can save some time and we can give back to this ecosystem that's really helped us. And he said, great, let's do it. So we, over a weekend, we worked on like the MVP with Rory, and we got it out there. And so I think that was like mid 2017. And so fast forward to 2020, late 2020, it was startupgalaxy.com.au. It had a jobs board for startup jobs. It had a directory of investors and startups and co-working spaces. It was getting all this traffic. And we decided, okay, we've already got that brand. Let's build this infrastructure piece and put it under that. And so we got our first client that wasn't ourselves, which is Scale Investors. They're a group that back female-led businesses. They've been around for over 10 years, and they're great. So we proved we could do it for scale. We were doing it for our activities. We got a financial services license, and we really started learning more about the space. And then after a while, some of the angels that were using us were like, hey, we're also investors in investment funds, and the experience has been really clunky as well. Can you go talk to this fund manager over here about helping like with their tooling and systems? And so after a while, we started doing not just syndicates, but also funds. And then fast forward to end of 2022, and people started reaching out to us who were from property and private equity, and they had family offices, or they were doing credit funds. And so we got this feedback. We really like your product, but the name just doesn't work because we're not in the venture ecosystem. And so we made the call in Jan of 2023 to rebrand to GXE. And our mission was to become the infrastructure, like the platform for family offices, investment funds, and investment syndicates, where like Microsoft Office, where there's all these apps for productivity, and you some people use them all, some people use a couple, but you just pay this one fee and you get it all. We're doing that for investment funds, and we've got clients where they were using this big legacy provider and they didn't know what was going on, or they were using Excel and Word and email themselves, or they were using a ton of different apps, like one for CRM, one for investor onboarding, one for their portal. And these apps are really good, but they're only good at one or two things. And so our offering was like, hey, get GXE, you'll get the whole suite. It'll all talk to each other and it'll just work. And so, yeah, we've been working on that since very late 2020. And yeah, it's been a really exciting couple of years.
Yeah. One of the things that I probably annoyingly do to you and the GXE team is just fire a bunch of feedback and stuff your way. I'm sure you get this a lot. But again, I think one of the challenging parts, and I see this because there's layers of complexity that you guys have to go through in terms of every time you build out new features or new focused product areas, and especially as you're expanding out from not just syndicates, but also VC funds to private equity to property and groups and those sort of things. How do you and the team think about those trade-offs of prioritization of different product features and product requests and those sorts of things?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we learnt a lot from the Omny Studio journey, and there's a lot of similar challenges around lots of different apps and processes into one platform, different users, different countries, different regulation, all of that. I think what really made this particular business challenging is there's just a really strong regulatory and compliance like element, and it's really important to our clients. We get that right. And so we do client-led development where every quarter we'll get together and we'll say, all right, here's what we said we were going to do last quarter. how much of that did we actually deliver? And here are the things that came up during that quarter that we had to do. And then what are all the things our clients are asking for the next quarter, and what's their business value? How many units of energy do we roughly think? And it's always wrong, like we'd need to do that. And so we run these sessions at the end of each quarter, and then they work out what we're going to focus on for the next couple of months. Now, there's a couple of things in there that are really big, that are bigger than one quarter, and we decide as a business, hey, we're going to do this big release and it's going to be 6 months away. But all the other stuff still goes through the process. And I think it's really hard to get right. And it's just something we're constantly looking at and trying to improve. But yeah, most of the features on GXE that you see have all come from a customer saying, hey, this is a problem for us and we'd really love to do this. And the same thing happened at Omny Studio. And it was funny, one of the people I've got a lot of advice from and who was fortunate enough to let me invest in their startup is Lee Jasper, and he does a lot to support the local Victorian and Australian ecosystems. One of the things him telling me is when he did AConnect, he and Rob were like, let's go to construction sites and let's find people using paper and using spreadsheets, and because we know we can build them into AConnect and do a much better job. And when we're at Southern Cross Hysteria, we got to go and sit in the studio and watch the shows and talk to the people. And with this one, we've really worked hard with these syndicates and funds and family offices on what is it you do now, where do you want to get to, and how can we help you get there to solve your problems, because it's about them.
Yeah, no, and as a user, really appreciate that. I guess one feature that I'm super excited about that you guys are kicking off that we're rolling into as well is a rolling fund. So this came off the back of a lot of the experience that we had with our investors. So we've been investing for the last 15 to 18 months or so. We've been fortunate to build a really great portfolio of companies. The challenge with the syndicate model sometimes is that because it's deal by deal, whenever we've decided to make an investment, we share materials out to our investors. Some of them are traveling at that time, don't check emails, everyone's super busy. And so in the best possible way, we've had some investors that have said frustratingly that they missed out on particular deals and wanted to find a way that they could get access to everything that we're investing in. And that's something that I spoke to you about is, Ed, I'd love to find a way for Playbook Ventures to be able to do that for our investors. But yeah, maybe do you want to share a little bit about the rolling fund structure and the new feature that you guys are rolling out with GXE?
Yeah, sure. So these have been in the US for quite a long time, and essentially there's a few different varieties, but what we found, exactly what you and James had experienced with Playbook Ventures, we had all these syndicate clients and they would do deal by deal, and then their customers, the investors, would come to them and they'd say, hey, you know what, syndicate managers, you're great and I love the deals, but I'm really busy. Is there a way I can just give you some money and you deploy it for me? Or, hey, I've been doing deal by deal, but for the next 6 months I'm going overseas, or this is happening. I just want to wait for you to do it. And in the past, some groups had sold this by doing they'd do a sidecar fund. There'd be a set open, there'd be a set close, and it was like herding cats. Whereas the beauty of these rolling funds is any day of the year I can say, hey, you know what, here's this syndicate. I think they're great. I want to give them some money. And then I'll give them money. It's going to get spread across a whole portfolio of the next deals they do in the future. So right now we've got a few clients that are rolling this out at the moment, and some that are already using it. And so ideally, if you put some money in over, say, 12 to 18 months, you get a portfolio of 10 companies that syndicate does. And it means if you're the syndicate manager, you can attract not just deal by deal capital, but you can now get this fully committed capital. And it also means when you're talking to founders, you can say, hey, obviously we'll take it to our audience and we hope they really like it, but we've got this much capital in our rolling fund that we can definitely put in pending DD and pending this and that. And it's given a lot of investors flexibility. It's given a lot of certainty to these syndicate managers. And it's been used in the US for quite a while. There are a couple of funds like Flying Fox that have been using it here. And yeah, we're really excited to see more folks using these kind of tools, and then investors getting a bigger menu of options with their capital.
Yeah, with the earlier iteration of Flying Fox and Working Theory Angels, which Rachel started, I was an LP in that. And it just makes life so much easier, especially if you trust the investment manager that's making decisions on your behalf. But like you said, I think a lot of it comes back to the user experience around those sort of things. So from the investor side of just making it super simple where they don't have to worry about those sorts of things. And if it's something that's aligned with their investment philosophy, it makes it a lot easier for them. And especially on the founder side, one of the challenges with syndicates is the lead time to close an opportunity, and also not really being sure of the final allocation. And so at least that means that we can be a little bit more certain of coming in at a higher base in terms of investment. And then if there's opportunity for us to top up, there are ways for us to do that as well.
Yeah, and what we hear from investors that they love is you can literally any day of the year put some cash in, you'll get this great portfolio, and then at the end of it, if you want to, you can keep putting money in, and you're not limited by those open and close requirements where you really like a particular firm, but you need to wait till they next do a fund, and it all needs to kind of align. And so, yeah, we're really excited on this structure for Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, or commit to like a significant amount of capital up front as well. I don't know what the structure is for other rolling funds that you've got on the platform, but we're trying to make it super easy and accessible for sophisticated investors to jump on board.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps with people who are more of a fit for an angel network, but want more of a fund style product and can't do the commitments needed for a much bigger fund. But yeah, obviously none of this is financial advice, and there's always an IM for each of our clients, and we work really hard with the clients to make sure all the right info's in there and investors can make the right decision for them.
Yeah. Amazing. Ed, I can talk to you for hours about things. We might need to get you back for round 2. But thank you so much for coming on and being so generous with lessons and insights from your journey so far. For anyone that wants to find out more, say hello, get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
Just add me on LinkedIn or shoot an email to ed@gxe.com. I'm definitely sometimes do take a while to respond on the emails just because, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, but definitely allocate some time each week to just helping founders from my portfolio or founders I haven't met yet on their journey just to pay it forward. And yeah, really appreciate the chance to be on the podcast. Yeah, I've definitely found a lot of your episodes to be really helpful.
Yeah, appreciate it. You're a legend, Ed. Glad to finally get you on. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Rohit.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 175 of the Startup Playbook podcast. As mentioned on this podcast, about 18 months ago, I officially launched an investment syndicate, Playbook Ventures, to invest into pre-seed and seed stage deals. Our goal at Playbook Ventures is to become the best performing early stage investor into high growth startups that I believe will be the next unicorns from this region. So far, the investors in the syndicate have been many of the guests that you would have heard on the podcast over the last 7.5 years, as well as a select group of people from my broader network. To date, we've invested in 7 different companies over that period and have seen some great traction so far with the acquisition of the very first company that we invested in, another company, Kismet, that we invested in at the pre-seed round 12 months ago, that just this week announced their $12.5 million seed funding round that we also participated in, as well as winning allocation into highly competitive rounds, including a deal recently that had 3 times the amount of committed interest for the amount that they were raising capital for. Today, I'm excited to announce that we're raising a rolling fund to double down our focus on investing into exceptional founders going after ambitious opportunities at the earlier stage. So if you're a founder currently raising your pre-seed round and would like to speak to us about your business, or if you're an investor wanting to invest into great early stage opportunities and want to apply to invest directly with us, head over to playbookventures.com.au, or you can email the team and me directly at fund@playbookventures.com.au. As mentioned at the start of this interview, this information is shared for information purposes only, and the opportunity to invest is currently only available to sophisticated investors. Investing in this area is extremely high risk, and as always, you should do your own due diligence before making any investment decisions. Once again, thanks for listening to episode 175 of the Startup Playbook podcast. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you enjoyed this interview, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.